All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday's lesson. Today's lesson is all on the types of forces. So we're basically just applying names to some of the forces that you already know, and I'll do it by doing just two object interaction diagram and force diagrams for two situations. So two situations and then defining the forces that we've talked about, but giving them the new physics names. So today you just need to learn the names and learn a little bit more about labeling the forces of different things. So start out with, I've got a box hanging by a rope attached to a wall, being held up by a man on top of a pole, on top of the ground, on top of the earth. All the objects. But for the object interaction diagram, we only need the object itself. In this case, it's going to be the crate or box, and the other objects that are affecting the box. So if I come over here to object interaction diagram, paste in my first object. So my first object is the box with, I know we got a circle around it. And so then the next object that's affecting the box. The next one I like to do is always the same one. It's the easiest, so I just get it out of the way. And if Mr. Yeager ever calls on you, this would be the first one you should snag. What's the forces acting? What's the first object interacting with the box? It is the Earth. So the Earth is the object that's pulling it down, causing gravity. The ground is a separate object, which is not involved in this one right here. And then the other object affecting the box is the string, or we'll call that one a rope. So we'll call that a rope. All right. Next, we want to add the interactions between them. Remember, it's just an arrow, so the rope is holding up the box. The earth is pulling on the box, but Newton's third law says that there's an equal and opposite force. So the box is also pulling back on the rope. So the box is pulling back on the rope, and the box is pulling back on the earth with its gravity. So there's my object interaction diagram. The object, the other two objects that are affecting it, and the arrows between them. All right. Next, we do the force diagram and say, okay, what are the forces acting on the box? So we talked about the object. Now, what are the forces? So the two forces we care about are the two forces here acting on the box. So we'll take an arrow and we will draw it down. Oh. Arrow, draw it straight down because gravity pulls an object straight down. And I'll label it force of Earth on box. F for force, and then I'll put an E on B, or E comma B. We'll make that a comma. I think I've been doing comma with you guys. Force Earth on box. We've been doing that. All right. And then the other force pulling on this would be the rope. Now, you could do the rope in two ways. You could say the rope is pulling off at an angle, but I'm more looking at that little rope there in the middle that seems to be pulling it up. But maybe you said there was two different ropes, or even if it's only one rope, if it's one rope, it's pulling it straight up, but maybe the two ropes are pulling it aside. Either way, we said it was one object, so we're going to give it one arrow. And I'll draw that arrow straight up, and I will make another force label. In this case, it's not the Earth on the box, it's the rope on the box. And again, we made that a comma there. So there's my force diagram. I've drawn the force of the Earth on the box and the force of the rope on the box. Now, we have some specific names for these different things that for certain forces. So the first two forces that I want to call your attention to is something called the force of gravity. I mentioned it before, force of gravity. We're going to actually label that Fg for force of gravity. So force of Earth on box is going to become F little g. And it is the force of attraction between any two objects with mass. So the Earth has mass, the box has mass, and so we have gravity between them. The force of attraction between the two objects. Not by one of the objects, but between them. So there's a force on one, force on the other. The other force that we're going to give a specific name to in this particular one is any force applied to an object by a string, cable, or rope. In this case, we have a rope holding up that box, so we're going to call this the force of tension. Tension's a big word for any force or something in a spring or rope. I guess spring would be another one there. But, so instead of saying force of rope on box, we're just going to call that a tension force. All right, let's take a look at one more. The next one will introduce three forces. So here we have a person pushing down on a box, but also sideways on a box. So they're not just pushing sideways, but kind of sideways and down on a box. And that box is sliding across the floor. We'll say it's sliding at a constant velocity, but it's not going to be that big of a deal for this one. So there he is. So the first thing we start with is the object interaction diagram. And so I will start with the object itself. So we have the box, with a circle around it. Box is the object. Now, what objects are interacting with the box? Oh, start with the easy one. Do the Earth first. Earth. What other object? Looks like I have the man pushing it. So I'll say man. All right. I've got the ground is supporting the object. So I've got the ground. And the last one is the ground again, but it's friction. So as you push, it's got friction against it. So we could put a double, or I guess quadruple arrow to ground, but remember, I think it's best to, or easiest, to treat friction as its own object, even though sometimes another object in the situation will be doing another force. We want to call friction its own thing. So I'm going to add one more circle for friction. Friction is a separate object. Let's abbreviate that friction. All right, lastly, we talk about which ones are interacting. This should become pretty easy. So the man's pushing on the box, but then the box is also pushing back on the man, right? The man can feel that resistance of the box, so that's a force that the man is feeling. The ground is pushing up on the box to support it, but the box is also pushing down on the ground, because if you were there, you would feel the box sitting on you. So equal and opposite forces. The Earth is definitely pulling the box down towards it from the center of the Earth, and then the box is pulling the Earth back up towards it, but it's that small force relative to the size of the Earth is barely noticeable. And finally, friction is pushing back on the box, resisting that motion of it, but the box is also rubbing against the ground. So there's an equal and opposite force there. So there they are. Newton's third law, every force there's an equal and opposite force, object interaction diagram. Okay, force diagram. All right, so we just need to draw one of each of these forces that are acting on the box. So we'll start out. I always start out with gravity there. So gravity is pulling that box downwards, and we'll label that the Earth. So we'll start with the Earth's force, and we'll label that force of Earth on the box. Next one will react to that, or let's do the apply. I've got the man pushing it. This is one. I'm not going to put the arrow over here. So even though you're like, oh, well, there's the man, he's pushing it, we always start the tip of the arrow at the dot. So here's that push by the man. And if we want to label that, we label that one the force of the man on the box. You then have the ground pushing up on it. So we can do ground there. I'm going to make that one pretty big because the ground is not only pushing the gravity up, but it's also pushing back on the man. So it's a bigger force there. I'm going to label that one the ground on the box. So we've done the earth, the man, the ground, so we just need friction. So we need one more force. Remember, identifying the objects is the easiest way because now I need one more force. So then I have friction. So is friction pushing it forwards with motion or against motion? Friction actually resists motion. It pushes back against the motion and makes it harder. You have to overcome that friction to make it work or to make it move or keep it moving if there is friction. And so we'll call that force of friction on box. And so now I've labeled my force diagram. But again, the point of today is to change these forces, the way we've been labeling their object names, into what physics calls them. So first one is Earth on box. That one we already said was G for gravity. But now we've got some new forces. So the first force is called applied force. Applied force is any force done on an object by a human or a machine, and maybe animal or something. But it's a force done by human or machine. So that's the one pushing down at an angle, and so we'll label that one Fa for applied force. The next is called the normal force. It's the support force. It's a force acting perpendicular to a surface. So, and done by the surface. So since the box is sitting on the ground, we'll say there's a normal force or support force pushing up on the box. We've drawn it here as the ground on the box, but we actually call that one the normal force. Normal, and that doesn't have to be straight up. It also doesn't have to be the same as gravity. Notice this, in this case, the normal force is bigger than gravity because not only is it overcoming the gravity down, but it's also overcoming the man pushing down. It's just like if you were to push down on a scale, or if someone were to push down on you while you're standing on a scale, the scale would read a much higher reading, because the scale reads the normal force, the scale would read a much higher reading than just your force of gravity, because there would be another force acting on you. So the scale reads both of the forces, not just gravity all the time. And finally, friction, force of friction. We'll just drop the label on it and make it a little f, and we'll call that the force of friction. It is the friction in box, but we'll call it just friction. So those are the 5 labels of forces. There is one more called air resistance. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. Air resistance is like friction, only done by the air. We also call that drag. So air resistance or drag would be the 6th label force that you're going to have to use. Other than that, that's it. So appreciate you watching the video. Finish up down below. It's just, I think it's 6 questions about these different forces. So step through it, and that's it. Good to see everyone, and see you all later this week.